Every conquering species eventually makes the same catastrophic miscalculation, and it always starts the exact same way, with a target they assume is too small to matter, and a response they never once imagined was even possible. The Kriv Ascendancy had conquered 200 worlds using exactly that same formula. Arrive, demand, destroy anyone foolish enough to resist. It had worked every single time, against every single species that had ever stood in their way, for 400 years without a single exception. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning by the Kriv's own calendar, a routine raiding squadron attacked a small human mining colony of 11,000 people that nobody in the Ascendancy's command structure had ever bothered to properly research. They expected panic. They expected surrender. What they got instead was a single garbled distress call, a captain who refused every order to withdraw, and less than 4 hours later, the beginning of the fastest, most complete military collapse in that empire's 400-year history. Nobody in the Ascendancy understood in that first terrible hour that they hadn't just attacked a mining colony. They had triggered a doctrine that had been sitting quietly in human command structures for over a century, waiting patiently for exactly this mistake to be made. And by the time this story ends, you will understand exactly why humanity never needed a bigger fleet, or a louder threat, or a longer warning. It only ever needed one single, unforgivable reason, and the Kriv Ascendancy handed them that reason, completely for free, without even realizing what they'd done. The message arrived at the Perseverance orbital relay at 3:47 station time, and it woke up nearly everyone still asleep on Alara 7. Captain Renav Vasquez was already on the bridge of the patrol frigate Meridian's watch when the transmission hit every screen, every speaker, and every personal device across the entire orbital station simultaneously. It was not a request. It was not any kind of greeting. It was a single sentence, repeated across 400 galactic languages, broadcast on every frequency the station's receivers could pick up. Submit, serve, or be rendered to ash. Vasquez stood very still for a long moment. She was a small woman with dark eyes and short, cropped hair, and she had spent 22 years in the United Earth Navy without ever once hearing a threat delivered in quite that tone. She had negotiated with pirates. She had handled a dozen minor border disputes. She had once talked down a drunk freighter captain who tried to ram a fuel depot over an unpaid docking fee. This felt entirely different, and she understood almost immediately that this was not a negotiation at all. It was simply an announcement. "Where is it coming from?" she asked. Her censor officer, a young man named Elias Park, was already working, his hands moving fast across the console. When he finally looked up, his face had gone pale. "Captain, I'm reading over 300 warships at the edge of the system. They dropped out of transit roughly 6 minutes ago. The broadcast is coming from all of them simultaneously." 300 warships. Vasquez had exactly one frigate, 2 patrol boats, and a station originally built for mining coordination rather than any kind of military defense. She ran the numbers in her head and did not care for the answer she arrived at. "Identify them," she said. "Kriv Ascendancy, Captain. Ship signatures match their standard Conquest fleet configuration." The bridge went quiet. Everyone aboard knew that name. The Kriv Ascendancy was one of the largest military powers in this entire region of the galaxy, an insectoid species, tall and heavily armored, mandibles capable of shearing through solid steel, an entire civilization built almost exclusively around the practice of conquest. They had subjugated more than 200 separate species across 3 galactic sectors over the preceding 4 centuries. Their method never varied. They arrived. They demanded surrender. If surrender did not come immediately, they destroyed everything in sight and simply started over on the resulting rubble. No species in 400 years had ever successfully resisted them. Not one. Vasquez took a slow, deliberate breath. She looked out through the bridge viewport at the stars beyond Alara 7's orbital ring. Somewhere out there, past the asteroid belt and the outer planetary bodies, 300 warships were currently waiting for a response. She pressed the comm control on her chair. "All hands, this is Captain Vasquez. We are moving to general quarters. This is not a drill. I want every civilian transport loaded and launched within 90 minutes. Every man, woman, and child currently on this station is leaving. Now," she paused. "Move fast, people. We do not have very much time." The evacuation of Alara 7 unfolded as chaos, but it was, at the very least, organized. Chaos. Humanity had learned, across a long and often painful history, how to move quickly when danger arrived without warning. The colonists moved with genuine, practiced purpose. Parents carried children. Workers grabbed emergency bags they'd packed months earlier and had never once expected to actually need. Transport ships filled steadily, one after another, and launched toward the inner system, toward the relay gate that would carry them back into safer, better defended territory. While the evacuation continued, Vasquez transmitted every scrap of available sensor data back to Earth: fleet composition, the exact wording of the threat, and a short, personal note to Naval Command that read simply, "They are not bluffing. Recommend immediate strategic response." Then she waited. The Kriv did not wait long at all. When no formal response arrived within the first hour, they transmitted a second message. This one was considerably shorter. "You have chosen Ash." The first volley struck the orbital station at 5:12 station time. Vasquez had already pulled the Meridian's watch back to cover the last remaining transport ships, and she watched, through her own sensors, as the station broke apart entirely. The Kriv weapons were powerful, precise, and utterly without any trace of mercy. The station had been home to almost 8,000 people. Most had already made it safely aboard the departing transports. Nearly 6,000 had not. Vasquez felt that number settle into her chest like a physical weight. She did not cry. She did not scream. She filed it away, quietly, in the particular place where soldiers learn to keep the things that will keep them awake for the rest of their lives, and she focused entirely on getting the surviving transports safely through the relay gate. The Meridian's watch took fire during the retreat itself. A Kriv destroyer clipped them with a beam that tore straight through the ship's lower decks and killed 9 crew members outright. Vasquez held the ship together through sheer, stubborn refusal to let it fall apart, and they limped through the relay gate with hull breaches across 3 separate decks and fire suppression running entirely on backup power. They made it through, barely. 12 light-years away on Earth, the news arrived like a physical blow to the stomach. Ambassador Idris Akhafer was eating a quiet breakfast in his apartment in Geneva when his communicator buzzed with a priority alert he had genuinely hoped he would never receive. He read the report twice through, slowly. He set down his coffee. He sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he stood, put on his coat, and walked directly to the Galactic Concord Embassy building without saying a single word to anyone along the way. The Galactic Concord functioned as the closest thing the galaxy possessed to a shared governing body. It was a loose coalition of more than 4,000 spacefaring civilizations, and it operated on the founding principle that talking things through was almost always preferable to shooting. It maintained formal rules, functioning courts, and a long, established history of resolving disputes between member species through patient negotiation and careful compromise. Aakafir had served as Earth's ambassador to the conquered for 11 years. He was a tall, calm man with gray steadily creeping into his temples and a voice that rarely rose above a conversational tone, even when he was genuinely, quietly furious. He entered the Conquered's great chamber that morning and requested an emergency session. He was granted one within the hour. The chamber itself was vast, filled with representatives of hundreds of different species. Some were tall and impossibly thin. Some were short and remarkably wide. Some floated silently in suspended liquid tanks. Some existed only as holographic projections beamed in from ships still in transit. Aakafir stood at the central speaking platform and laid out the plain facts. Alara 7, nearly 6,000 dead. An unprovoked attack by the Kriv Ascendancy against an entirely civilian mining station. He formally requested mediation, peacekeeping assistance, and a unified diplomatic condemnation. The response was not what he had genuinely hoped for. The elder species within the conquered listened politely enough. Some offered sincere-sounding condolences. But when the conversation turned to actual concrete action, the answer proved remarkably consistent across nearly every delegation present. The Kriv Ascendancy falls well outside the practical scope of conquered intervention, said the Velesi representative, a being that closely resembled a slowly walking coral reef. We would advise the human delegation to seriously consider the practical realities of your current situation. Practical realities, Aakafir repeated, his voice remaining level despite everything. The Ascendancy has conquered more than 200 species. Their military capability considerable exceeds anything your own civilization could realistically match. We suggest you consider negotiating terms of vassalage instead. The Kriv are harsh masters, but survival remains preferable to outright extinction. Several other delegates nodded along in quiet agreement. Some didn't even bother offering a verbal response at all. They had evidently seen this exact story play out many times before. A small civilization picks a fight it cannot win, or more commonly, a considerably larger one simply picks the fight for them. The smaller civilization inevitably vanishes from the galactic map within a generation or two. It was, by this point, considered sad. It was also, in the collective view of most of the assembled delegates, entirely inevitable. Aakafir stood quietly at the speaking platform and looked out across the full chamber. 4,000 civilizations in attendance, and not one of them appeared genuinely willing to offer any meaningful help. He was not, in truth, especially surprised. He was, however, quietly and thoroughly angry underneath his composed exterior. He leaned forward slightly and spoke directly into the microphone. "We appreciate the Council's counsel," he said, his voice remaining calm and entirely even. "Humanity will handle this matter internally." He stepped down from the platform and walked out of the chamber without waiting for any further response. Behind him, a handful of delegates exchanged mildly puzzled glances. Most did not bother reacting at all. The humans, they privately assumed, would surrender within a month at most. Everyone, in the end, always did. Back on Earth, the governments of the world convened within hours in the fastest unified response in recorded human history. The attack on Alara 7 had killed people from 37 separate nations. The dead included miners from Brazil, engineers from Japan, teachers from Nigeria, doctors from Norway, and children who had been born aboard the station itself and had never once seen Earth's actual sky. The formal debate lasted a matter of minutes. The resulting vote was entirely unanimous. War. United Earth Military Command began full mobilization within a matter of hours. Factories that had spent the previous decade building purely civilian vessels switched immediately to warship production. Research laboratories that had quietly studied, recovered alien technology for decades were suddenly granted unlimited funding and a single, unambiguous instruction: make weapons. Recruitment offices across every continent opened their doors and were fully overwhelmed before those same doors had even finished swinging open. Humanity did not panic in the face of this attack. Humanity got angry instead, and there was a very significant difference between those two responses. A difference the Kriv Ascendancy did not yet understand, and would not understand until it was already far too late to matter. Far away, inside the command chamber of the Ascendancy's lead flagship, Overlord Kethrix Vaughn received an intelligence briefing regarding the species his fleet had just attacked. It was a cultural assessment, hastily compiled, describing humanity as a young, fragmented, technologically inferior civilization possessing no significant military capability of any real consequence. It recommended continuing with entirely standard conquest protocols. Kethrix glanced briefly at the report. He did not bother reading it in full. He had personally overseen dozens of conquests across his long career, and they were, in his considerable experience, all essentially the same story. The conquered species resisted for a brief while, and then, without exception, they eventually broke. Humanity, he assumed without any particular concern, would prove no different. He set the report aside and returned his attention to the logistics of moving his fleet deeper into human-controlled territory. There were, after all, more worlds still to claim, more resources to extract, more species still waiting to be brought properly under Ascendancy control. Humanity, in his estimation, amounted to little more than a minor, temporary inconvenience. They would learn their proper place soon enough. He was wrong. Catastrophically, historically, permanently wrong. He simply did not know it yet. And by the time he finally understood exactly how wrong he had been, it would already be far too late for that understanding to matter in any meaningful way. In the first 90 days of the war, humanity lost 5 separate star systems. The Kriv advanced like an unstoppable wave. Their fleets were massive, thoroughly disciplined, and built entirely around a single, simple purpose: crush everything directly in front of them, then keep moving forward without pause. They took the colony at Bridgewater in a matter of 6 hours. They took the mining outpost at Kessler's Drift in barely 3. They rolled straight through the farming world of New Cambria in a single afternoon. Burning fields and cracking opened the domes that kept the colony's breathable air properly sealed inside. From the outside, looking in, it genuinely appeared as though the war was already effectively over. The wider Galactic Concord watched the incoming reports with the tired, weary familiarity of an audience that had witnessed this particular story unfold 100 times before. Small civilization picks a fight. Larger civilization crushes it entirely. The galaxy quietly moves on to other concerns. Several conquered diplomats had, in fact, already begun quietly drafting proposals for how humanity's colonial assets might eventually be redistributed, following the presumably inevitable surrender. But that surrender never actually came. Instead, something considerably stranger began happening across the worlds the Kriv had already conquered. On Bridgewater, 3 days after the Kriv garrison had properly settled in, a water treatment plant suddenly, catastrophically exploded. The blast killed 47 Kriv soldiers outright and poisoned the entire water supply for the colony's eastern district. Kriv engineers eventually traced the explosion to a simple chemical reaction, triggered by a homemade timer built from an old kitchen clock and 2 lengths of ordinary wire. It had been constructed, entirely alone, by a retired plumber named George Harlan, 63 years old, who had never once held a weapon of any kind in his entire life. On Kessler's drift, the Kriv communications array mysteriously went dark every single night, precisely at midnight. Every single night, Kriv technicians would carefully repair it. Every single night, it would go dark again. It took them nearly 2 full weeks to finally discover that a 12-year-old girl named Sophia Reyes was quietly crawling through the mining complex's ventilation shafts each night and physically pulling the same cable from the same junction box. They sealed those particular shafts entirely. She found another route in. They sealed that route too. She eventually started cutting the cable directly from outside, in a vacuum suit she had personally salvaged from a dead miner's storage locker. On New Cambria, the Kriv had burned the colony's fields, so the surviving farmers quietly poisoned the wells instead, using specially selected chemicals harmless to human biology, but devastatingly effective against Kriv physiology. It took the Kriv's medical corps nearly a full month to determine why their soldiers kept mysteriously falling ill and dying. By the time they finally identified the cause, 60% of the occupying garrison had already been rendered combat ineffective. The Kriv ascendancy had, over the course of 4 centuries, successfully conquered more than 200 separate species. None of them had ever done anything remotely like this. When a species was properly conquered, they submitted quietly. They went silent. They accepted their new rulers and focused entirely on simply surviving under the new arrangement. That was how conquest was always supposed to work. Humans, evidently, had not received that particular instruction. On the colony world of Threshold, the situation grew considerably worse for the Kriv than anywhere else. Threshold was a mountainous world defined by deep valleys and dense forests, and its human colonists had flatly refused to evacuate when the invasion began. When the Kriv finally landed, they expected a quick, straightforward occupation. What they actually got was a genuine, sustained nightmare. Sergeant Mateo Herrera, known throughout his unit simply as Brick because he was, quite literally, built like one, led a squad of 14 Marines in the defense of a narrow mountain pass known locally as the Widow's Gate. It represented the only viable ground route into the colony's primary settlement, and Herrera had originally been ordered to hold it for exactly 24 hours, while the remaining civilians escaped through the valleys behind the settlement. He held it for 11 days straight. His squad rigged mines from ordinary industrial explosives and scavenged scrap metal. They set tripwires across the pass, specifically designed to trigger controlled rock slides. They positioned speakers to broadcast the sounds of human voices from entirely empty positions, deliberately drawing Kriv fire toward bare rock, while the actual squad fired from concealed positions elsewhere. They deliberately set fires in the forest below the pass, creating heavy smoke that reliably blinded Kriv thermal sensors. When they eventually ran entirely out of mines, they simply rolled boulders down the slopes by hand. When they finally ran out of standard ammunition, they improvised crossbows from salvaged vehicle suspension springs. When 2 of Herrera's Marines were wounded too badly to fire a rifle, he had them load spare magazines and sharpen wooden stakes instead, specifically for jamming into Kriv leg joints during close combat. The Kriv eventually sent a full battalion up that pass. They lost 200 soldiers in the first 2 days alone. They sent an entire 2nd battalion. They lost another 100. The pass itself was narrow, The terrain was genuinely brutal, and every single rock formation seemed to be quietly hiding something specifically designed to kill them. On the 8th day, a Kriv field commander sent a formal message to Herrera's position, offering surrender in exchange for guaranteed safe passage for his remaining Marines. Herrera's reply consisted of exactly one word, and it was decidedly not polite. When the 11 days finally concluded and reinforcements at last arrived, Herrera walked down from that mountain pass with only 6 surviving Marines, all of them wounded, but all of them still on their feet. Behind them, the pass itself was choked with Kriv dead. The final count was later confirmed at 412. Herrera sat down heavily on a nearby rock, accepted a canteen of water from a relief medic, and said simply, "I need more crossbow bolts." 12,000 light-years away, inside a university research laboratory on a conquered world called Tessera, a xenoanthropologist named Tylon Ori watched all of this unfold with a growing, deeply personal sense of horror. Tylon Ori belonged to the Velesi, the same coral-derived species whose representative had once told Ambassador Akafer to simply surrender. But Tylon Ori was a scholar first and foremost, not any kind of politician. He studied species, their behavior, their biology, their cultures, their long-term historical patterns. And something about humanity he had gradually come to realize was fundamentally, unsettlingly wrong. Not wrong as in broken, wrong as in genuinely, statistically impossible. Every existing model of interspecies conflict predicted, with considerable confidence, that a civilization as young and comparatively small as humanity should collapse entirely within 30 days of facing sustained Kriv aggression. Those models carefully accounted for military strength, available economic resources, total population size, and overall technological development. By virtually every established measure, this particular war should already have been decisively over before it had properly even started. The models simply did not account for what Tylon Ori was now personally observing. He began digging methodically into humanity's recorded history, accessing every database and archive he could possibly reach. What he found there made him stop eating properly for 2 full days straight. Humans, he discovered, were fundamentally predators, not ambush predators in the traditional biological sense, and not exclusively pack hunters either. They were something considerably worse, in a very specific evolutionary sense. They were persistence predators. Their distant ancestors on Earth had originally hunted by physically chasing their prey across enormous distances, not faster than the animal being pursued, but simply longer. They would follow a single creature for hours, sometimes even days, never truly stopping, never fully resting, until the exhausted animal eventually collapsed entirely from sheer heat and exhaustion. The human hunter would then simply walk up and finish it off. They had never won through raw physical superiority. They had won, throughout their entire evolutionary history, by refusing ever to actually stop. Tylon Ori kept reading, and that was where the true horror genuinely began. Humans had been fighting recorded wars against each other for effectively their entire documented history. Thousands of years of continuous, escalating conflict. Millions upon millions of casualties, repeated over and over again, generation after generation. They had fought wars over land, over competing religions, over abstract ideas, over scarce resources, and sometimes for reasons so genuinely complicated that even they themselves could no longer fully articulate them. They had invented weapons capable of destroying their entire home planet several times over. They had actually built those weapons, pointed them directly at each other, and then, somehow collectively decided not to actually use them, while nonetheless keeping every single one fully ready, just in case. They possessed a specific cultural concept they called total war. It meant that once pushed sufficiently far, they did not simply send soldiers into battle. They sent essentially everyone. Factories transformed overnight into weapons plants. Farmers became soldiers. Scientists became weapons designers. Children carried urgent messages between checkpoints. Elderly women hid ammunition stockpiles inside their own kitchens. An entire civilization, when sufficiently provoked, effectively became a single unified weapon, aimed directly and entirely at whatever threat it currently faced. No other species in the entirety of the conquered's extensive records possessed anything remotely comparable to this particular cultural trait. When other species fought wars, they fought using their military exclusively. When humans fought wars, they fought with absolutely everything they had and everything they fundamentally were as a civilization. Tylon Ori sat alone in his laboratory, surrounded on every side by screens full of documented human history, and felt something he had genuinely never experienced before in his long academic career. It was a cold, creeping realization that the wider galaxy had made an enormous, potentially catastrophic mistake. Not the humans themselves, the galaxy as a whole. Everyone had looked at humanity and seen only a small, young, comparatively weak species that would be easy to safely ignore. Nobody had actually looked closely enough to see exactly what lay quietly underneath that surface impression. Meanwhile, in a quiet, secured room on Earth, General Yuki Tanaka sat staring at a wall entirely covered in tactical maps. Tanaka served as chief strategist for United Earth Military Command, and she had not visibly panicked when the first colonies fell. She had not panicked during the second wave of losses either. She had not panicked at all, in fact, and this steady calm made her own staff increasingly nervous, because people who remained perfectly calm during genuine disasters were generally either extremely brave or genuinely dangerous. Tanaka, as it happened, was both. She was carefully watching the Kriv's overall advance, and crucially, she was quietly learning from it. Every single colony that fell transmitted valuable sensor data before finally going dark: fleet movement patterns, weapon signature profiles, shield frequency data, communication protocols, established command patterns. The Kriv had no idea at all, but every world they conquered was, in effect, quietly teaching Tanaka exactly how to eventually defeat them. She was deliberately trading territory for critical information, and the price for that trade was genuinely terrible. She paid it anyway because the realistic alternative was considerably worse. She stood in front of her wall of maps, methodically moving pins and drawing connecting lines and running detailed calculations, and slowly, piece by careful piece, an actual plan began taking coherent shape. It was not by any measure a kind or gentle plan. It was the calculated plan of a species that had already survived ice ages, devastating plagues, 2 full world wars, and the invention of its own nuclear weapons. And it rested on one simple, foundational truth the Kriv had not yet begun to properly understand. Humans did not fight wars purely to survive. They fought wars to win outright, and there existed a very significant, very meaningful difference between those two particular things. On the far side of the galaxy, Tylon Ori finished compiling his research and did something genuinely unusual for a conquered academic. He sent an unsolicited message directly to the Kriv Ascendancy's own intelligence division. It was not, strictly speaking, his place to do so. It violated at least half a dozen separate Concord protocols governing academic conduct. He sent it anyway because he was genuinely frightened, and because he believed with total sincerity that someone in a position to act really ought to know. The message itself was short. "You have made a profound miscalculation," it read. "These beings do not surrender, they do not forget, and they have only been quietly buying time." The Kriv intelligence officer who eventually received that message read it once, marked it as entirely irrelevant, and promptly deleted it without further consideration. In the mountain passes of Threshold, Sergeant Herrera was already busy teaching local civilians how to build functional crossbows from salvaged vehicle parts. On the burned fields of New Cambria, farmers were carefully mixing a fresh, improved batch of their improvised poison, one specifically designed this time to seep through Kriv armor seals rather than requiring ingestion. On Bridgewater, a retired plumber's own granddaughter was quietly building her very first working explosive device. And on Earth, General Tanaka continued studying her maps. For the first time in 90 days, she finally allowed herself a genuine smile. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a particularly kind smile. It was the smile of a species that had finally finished patiently learning and was now fully prepared to begin actively teaching. On the 91st day of the war, humanity stopped retreating entirely. There was no formal announcement, no grand ceremonial speech, no dramatic moment involving a flag being triumphantly raised while trumpets sounded somewhere in the background. There was simply a quiet, decisive shift, as subtle and as ultimately deadly as a knife being carefully drawn in a completely dark room. One day the Kriv were steadily advancing. The very next day they simply weren't anymore. And day after that, they had begun, quietly and steadily, to die. General Yuki Tanaka's overall strategy would eventually come to be known, though she herself never formally named it, as the Tanaka Doctrine, a plan that military academies across a dozen different galactic civilizations would spend the following decades carefully studying, some treating it as a work of genuine tactical genius, others condemning it outright as borderline madness. Quite possibly, in the end, it was accurately described as both at once. The doctrine itself rested on one deceptively simple foundational idea. Do not fight the Kriv the exact way the Kriv fully expect to be fought. The Kriv understood warfare fundamentally as a matter of fleets and rigid formations. They lined their ships up carefully, pointed them directly at whatever enemy they faced, and then advanced steadily using pure, overwhelming firepower. This approach had reliably defeated every single species they had ever previously encountered in 4 centuries of continuous conquest. Their ships were consistently larger, their weapons consistently stronger, and their numbers consistently greater than any opponent they'd faced. Any enemy attempting to match them directly, ship for ship, would inevitably lose. This was, by this point, considered an essentially mathematical certainty within Kriv military doctrine. Tanaka had absolutely no intention of matching them ship for ship. The first genuine sign that something fundamental had changed came at a Kriv supply depot located in the Korath system. The depot itself sat deep behind established Kriv lines, far removed from any active combat front, protected by a garrison of 30 full warships. It stored fuel, ammunition, and essential food supplies for an entire sector fleet, and it was, by every reasonable assessment, considered completely secure. At precisely 4:00 local station time, 12 human frigates dropped abruptly out of transit directly inside the depot's own defensive perimeter. They appeared with essentially no warning at all, moving at full attack speed, and opened concentrated fire before the surprised Kriv garrison could even properly raise their shields. The frigates targeted the fuel storage tanks first, then the ammunition bunkers, then finally the food warehouses. The entire depot was fully engulfed in flames within roughly 8 minutes. The attacking frigates then turned and jumped back into transit before the remaining garrison ships could even form a coordinated firing line. Total Kriv losses: 1 entire supply depot, 4 warships, and roughly 6 months' worth of carefully stockpiled resources. Total human losses: 1 frigate damaged, 0 destroyed outright. The exact same pattern repeated itself at 3 additional depots that same night, and again the following night, and again the night after that. The Kriv had genuinely never faced hit-and-run tactics deployed at this particular scale before. Their entire established military doctrine simply had no real concept for it. When they fought in traditional lines and formations, in large-scale fleet engagements where sheer accumulated strength ultimately decided every outcome, the idea of an enemy simply appearing from apparent nowhere, striking a single high-value target, and vanishing entirely before any coordinated response could even be organized, wasn't merely unfamiliar to them. It was considered, by their own long-standing cultural standards, genuinely dishonorable. They called it dismissively cowardice. Tanaka called it, quite simply, winning. But the supply depot raids represented only the very beginning of the overall strategy. On the various occupied worlds themselves, the quiet resistance that had been steadily simmering for 90 days finally erupted into genuine, full-scale warfare. It was not the organized, uniformed military resistance of soldiers wearing recognizable ranks. It was something considerably worse, in a very specific sense. It was the collective resistance of an entire species that had decided, both individually and collectively, that they would genuinely rather die fighting on their feet than continue living quietly on their knees. On Bridgewater, resistance fighters began openly broadcasting Kriv casualty figures directly over the Ascendancy's own communication channels. Every single morning, the occupying Kriv garrison would activate their communications and hear a calm, steady human voice reading through a list of names. Not human names. Kriv names, the names of every single Kriv soldier killed the previous day, read slowly and clearly, complete with the precise time and location of each individual death. The psychological effect proved genuinely devastating. The Kriv were a hive-adjacent species by nature, and they felt the loss of their own kind with unusual collective depth. Hearing their own dead named individually, one after another, by the very creatures who had actually killed them, unsettled them in ways that no conventional weapon ever quite managed to replicate. On Threshold, Sergeant Herrera and his steadily growing force of civilian fighters shifted decisively onto the offensive. They emerged from the surrounding mountains under cover of darkness, striking Kriv patrols, supply convoys, and communication relays. And they never once repeated the exact same tactic twice in a row. One night it was carefully placed explosives. The next night it was concealed pit traps instead. The night after that, they successfully diverted an entire river directly into a Kriv underground bunker complex, drowning everyone stationed inside. On New Cambria, local farmers discovered that Kriv armor seals proved genuinely vulnerable to a specific acid compound that could be manufactured entirely from common agricultural chemicals already available on the colony. They loaded that compound into modified crop-spraying drones and flew them silently over Kriv encampments during the night. The occupying soldiers woke each morning to find their own armor slowly, painfully dissolving directly against their skin. And then there was Project Fenrir. deep inside a mountain complex on Earth, in a research laboratory that did not officially exist on any public record. Dr. Lena Schroeder had spent the preceding 90 days accomplishing something that should have realistically taken several years under normal circumstances. She had personally analyzed sensor data from every single engagement with the Kriv fleet, carefully mapped their shield frequencies and armor composition, and ultimately built a weapon specifically, deliberately designed to kill them. She called it, with characteristic bluntness, the Godkiller Lance. It functioned as a directed energy weapon operating on a frequency precisely tuned to pass directly through Kriv's shield harmonics without meaningful resistance. It did not attempt to overpower those shields directly. It did not attempt to root around them either. It simply passed straight through them, as though they weren't actually present at all, and then struck whatever lay directly behind them with enough concentrated, focused energy to cut cleanly through Kriv capital ship armor like a heated wire through soft butter. When Dr. Schroeder formally demonstrated the weapon for military command, she fired it at a recovered piece of actual Kriv hull plating salvaged from a destroyed destroyer. The resulting beam punched cleanly through the plating, continued straight through the reinforced concrete wall positioned behind it, punched through the solid rock behind that as well, and eventually buried itself somewhere deep within the surrounding mountain. The demonstration room fell into complete silence. General Tanaka looked at the resulting hole in the wall and simply asked, "How many of these can you actually build?" Dr. Schroeder replied without hesitation, "How many do you actually need?" The answer, as it turned out, was every single one they could possibly produce. Admiral Joaquin Reyes was given formal command of Operation Harrow, the first major human counteroffensive of the entire war. His designated target was the Threshold system, where Sergeant Herrera's ongoing guerrilla campaign had already weakened the local Kriv garrison to the very edge of complete collapse. Reyes was an old, experienced naval officer, calm and steady by nature, possessing a voice like gravel and a mind that worked like a carefully sprung trap. He had spent the first 90 days of the war personally watching other officers steadily lose both their ships and their crews, and he had quietly sworn to himself that when his own turn finally came, he intended to make it count for something real. His available fleet was barely half the size of the established Kriv Defense Force stationed in the Threshold system. This particular fact did not concern him especially. He had Godkiller Lances now mounted on every single ship under his command, and he had developed a plan the Kriv would genuinely never see coming until it was already far too late. The Battle of Threshold lasted a full 72 hours. Reyes brought his fleet into the system in 3 carefully coordinated waves, striking the Kriv from 3 entirely different directions simultaneously. The first wave successfully drew the Kriv fleet out of its established defensive formation. The second wave then struck their exposed flanks directly with the Godkiller Lances, punching cleanly through both shields and armor, tearing capital ships apart from the inside out. The third wave then did something the conquered would later officially describe as the single most reckless tactical decision in all of recorded military history. They boarded the Kriv ships directly. Human Marines wearing powered combat armor launched themselves across the open void between opposing vessels using maneuvering thrusters, latched securely onto Kriv hulls with magnetic clamps, cut directly through airlocks using plasma torches, and fought their way inside the enemy ships in brutal close-quarters combat. The Kriv had never once been boarded in this manner, not in their entire recorded military history. They possessed no established protocols for it, no relevant training whatsoever, and no real understanding of exactly what kind of species would voluntarily throw itself directly into the belly of an active enemy warship in the middle of an ongoing battle. The resulting fighting inside those ships proved close, brutal, and genuinely ugly. Humans fought using rifles, combat knives, bare fists, and whatever else they could physically tear loose from the surrounding walls. A single Kriv soldier was considerably larger than a human, considerably stronger, and covered in natural armor plating. None of that ultimately mattered when a human Marine with genuinely nothing left to lose jammed an explosive charge directly into the gap between armor plates and detonated it at point-blank range. The Kriv broke eventually, not all at once but steadily, piece by piece, ship by individual ship. Their fleet formation scattered entirely. Some ships attempted retreat. Some formally surrendered. Some fought on stubbornly until the very last soldier fell. By the conclusion of those 72 hours, the threshold system had been fully liberated, and the Kriv had lost more than 100 warships in the process. On the surface of Threshold itself, Sergeant Herrera watched the surviving Kriv transports flee into the sky above, then sat down heavily on a nearby rock. He had been fighting continuously for 94 days without any real rest. He was thin, visibly scarred, and missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a Kriv blade injury sustained weeks earlier. When the first relief soldiers from the arriving fleet finally reached his position, he looked up at them and simply asked, "What took you so long?" Far away, aboard the Ascendancy flagship, Overlord Kethrix Vaughn received the full reports from Threshold. He read through them slowly. Then he read them a second time. Then he did something he had genuinely not done since the entire war had first begun. He pulled up the original cultural assessment of humanity his own intelligence officer had submitted on day 1 of the conflict, the same report he had never actually bothered reading in full. He read it now carefully. It was short, dismissive, and filled entirely with incorrect generalizations and flawed assumptions. He threw the report physically across the room in frustration. Then he requested the full battlefield recordings from every occupied world. He watched all of them without exception. He watched a human farmer on New Cambria, a woman missing her entire right arm from a Kriv plasma round, calmly strangling a Kriv soldier with a length of wire pulled directly from a fence. He watched children on Bridgewater deliberately setting fire to a Kriv supply warehouse while singing a song he genuinely couldn't understand. He watched a recorded clip from Threshold showing a human Marine, bleeding heavily from wounds that should have killed him outright, charging directly at a Kriv position while wielding an empty rifle purely as a melee weapon. The Marine, remarkably, was laughing throughout the entire charge. Kethrix finally turned off the display. He sat alone in his command chamber for a considerable while afterward, then called his intelligence officer directly and asked a single, simple question. "What exactly are they?" The intelligence officer did not have any meaningful answer to offer him. In the following weeks, an entirely new word began appearing steadily throughout the Kriv language, spreading quickly through their military ranks like a kind of contagious illness, whispered nervously in barracks, murmured quietly through the corridors of their warships. The word roughly translated to something close to the endless. It was not, by any measure, intended as a title of respect. It was not offered as any kind of compliment either. It was, instead, precisely the kind of word frightened soldiers use when discussing something they genuinely cannot understand, and more importantly, cannot seem to stop. It functioned in its own way as a kind of desperate, unspoken prayer. A small, quiet prayer from a species that was beginning to realize, far too late to matter, exactly what kind of fight they had actually picked. Not because the humans were somehow stronger, not because they were fundamentally smarter, not because their available weapons were meaningfully superior, but simply because they would not, under any circumstances, actually stop. No matter what was done to them, no matter how many individual humans were killed, no matter how many worlds were burned to the ground in retaliation. They would not stop, and the survivors would inevitably pick up the weapons of the fallen and keep coming regardless. The following day, and the day after that, and the day after that indefinitely, until one side was left standing victorious, and the other had been reduced entirely to dust. The Kriv had successfully conquered 200 species by being, without question, the single most relentless military force in the entire galaxy. They had just encountered something considerably more relentless than themselves, and for the very first time in 400 years, they were genuinely, deeply afraid. 6 months into the war, the Galactic Conquered could no longer reasonably pretend the entire situation wasn't actually happening around them. For the first 3 months of the conflict, the Conquered had treated the ongoing human-Kriv war exactly the way it habitually treated every other conflict involving a comparatively minor species. They filed formal reports, expressed polite, official concern, and quietly waited for the entirely predictable, expected conclusion. Several delegates had, in fact, already begun discreetly discussing how humanity's various colonial territories might eventually be divided up following the presumed surrender. But that surrender never actually arrived, and with the Kriv now visibly in full, chaotic retreat while human fleets steadily pushed deeper into ascendancy territory, the overall mood inside the conquered chamber had shifted dramatically. Ambassador Ockhaffer had spent 6 full months sitting quietly in that same chamber, listening patiently as representatives of 4,000 different species discussed his own people as though they were already effectively dead. He had not argued the point. He had not begged for assistance. He had simply sat quietly in his assigned chair, taken careful notes, and waited patiently for the appropriate moment. Now, with an emergency session called for the very first time since the war had actually started, the chamber was, for once, completely full. Every seat occupied. Every species formally represented. The topic under discussion was not, this time, primarily the Kriv ascendancy. The topic, instead, was humanity itself. Scholar Tylon Ori was formally summoned to present his complete findings. He had spent the preceding 6 months buried entirely in mountains of accumulated data, research, and historical records. He had not slept properly in weeks. His naturally coral-like body had taken on a distinctly grayish tint his own species typically associated with extreme, sustained stress, and his hands trembled slightly as he approached the central speaking platform. He had been formally asked to provide the conquered with a comprehensive analysis of humanity as a species. He had completed that assignment thoroughly. He genuinely wished, at this point, that he hadn't. He stood at the platform and looked out across the assembled delegates. Thousands of eyes, sensory organs, and quivering optical structures all staring back at him expectantly. He took a slow breath and began. I have studied more than 3,000 distinct species across my academic career, he said. I have carefully cataloged their behaviors, their capabilities, and their potential threat level to the wider galactic community. In all that time, I have genuinely never encountered anything remotely comparable to the humans. He activated his first display, showing a detailed diagram of human biology. Physically, humans are entirely unremarkable. They are medium-sized, they possess no natural armor, no claws, no venom of any kind. Their sensory capabilities are average at best. Their raw physical strength is genuinely modest. On paper, they should not represent a meaningful threat to any species currently present in this chamber. He paused deliberately. This particular assessment is dangerously, fundamentally incorrect. He changed the display. It now showed a detailed map of Earth overlaid with historical migration patterns. Humans evolved on a single planet possessing extreme environmental variation, deserts, ice fields, dense jungles, mountain ranges, open oceans. They did not evolve to specialize for any single environment. Instead, they adapted successfully to essentially all of them simultaneously. There is no known climate on their homeworld where humans genuinely cannot survive. They routinely live in conditions that would kill most other species present in this chamber within a matter of hours. He changed the display once more, this time showing a running human figure positioned beside several common prey animals. They are, fundamentally, persistence predators. Their evolutionary ancestors did not hunt through ambush or superior speed. They hunted specifically by relentlessly following their prey until it eventually collapsed from sheer exhaustion. A human cannot physically outrun a deer. But a human can simply keep walking, keep jogging steadily forward, long after the deer itself has overheated and finally fallen. They do not fundamentally need to be faster. They only ever need to refuse to stop. The chamber remained completely silent. Their underlying biology directly supports this behavior, he continued. They sweat continuously, which allows for considerably more efficient body temperature regulation than almost any other comparable land animal on their homeworld. They can function reasonably well on genuinely minimal sleep. They can digest almost anything remotely organic. They can continue operating effectively while sustaining injuries that would completely incapacitate or outright kill most other species. There is extensive documentation of humans walking on broken bones, fighting effectively with missing limbs, and remaining fully conscious and functional after blood loss that should, by any reasonable medical standard, have left them comatose. He shifted to a new display, this one showing an extensive timeline of documented human conflicts, filling the entire screen, then continuing across several additional screens beyond that. Their recorded history consists of an almost entirely unbroken record of continuous conflict. They have fought wars over territory, over natural resources, over competing ideologies, over religious belief, over national pride, and in some documented cases, for reasons that even they themselves can no longer fully explain or articulate. And the sheer scale of these conflicts is genuinely difficult to properly comprehend. He highlighted several specific points along the extended timeline. In a single documented conflict they refer to as the Second World War, they lost approximately 70 to 85 million individual lives. This represented roughly 3% of their entire global population at that specific time. That war lasted 6 full years. They did not stop fighting. They instead increased weapons production, fielded progressively larger armies, and developed entirely new categories of technology, including weapons capable of destroying entire cities in a single detonation. And they continued fighting until one side had been completely, decisively defeated. A murmur of visible unease rippled steadily through the assembled chamber. Tylon Ori waited patiently for it to fade before continuing. Following that particular conflict, they proceeded to build considerably more of those same city-destroying weapons. They eventually built enough of them to destroy their entire home planet several times over. Two rival factions then pointed those same weapons directly at one another for several decades. Neither side ultimately fired. They simply waited, each side remaining fully prepared to end their own species entirely should the other side make the first move. The murmur grew noticeably louder. Several delegates were now visibly whispering urgently among themselves. A few had already begun quietly moving toward the chamber's exits. Tylon Ori raised one hand, requesting silence. He was not yet finished. But the single most relevant finding for this particular chamber, he continued, is not their demonstrated capacity for organized violence. It is their capacity for genuine, sustained spite. The chamber fell into complete, absolute silence. Humans will actively harm themselves in order to harm a designated enemy. They will willingly sacrifice available resources, meaningful strategic advantages, and even their own lives, not purely for tactical gain, but specifically to ensure that an opponent genuinely suffers in return. No other species currently present in our extensive records demonstrates this particular behavior at a full civilizational scale. Most species will surrender once the calculated cost of continued fighting exceeds any realistic potential benefit. Humans do not reliably perform that particular calculation. When sufficiently angered, they will burn their own house down entirely, provided their enemy burns along with it. He paused once more, looking directly at the assembled delegates. They also routinely form deep emotional attachments to entirely abstract concepts and will willingly die specifically to protect them. A flag, a song, a particular memory, a specific patch of ground where something meaningful once happened to them. They will fight and die for things that possess no inherent material value whatsoever, because the value they personally assign to these things is not material at all. It is purely emotional, and to a human, emotional value functions as genuinely real value. He changed the display one final time, showing a comparative graph tracking Kriv technology against rapidly advancing human technology across the preceding 6 months of open conflict. In 6 months, humans have successfully reverse-engineered Kriv shield harmonics, weapon systems, and propulsion technology. Technologies that originally took the Kriv several centuries to properly develop, humans replicated in a matter of months. Not because they are inherently more intelligent as a species, because they are considerably more motivated. When a human identifies a specific problem they need solved, they will apply every available resource towards solving it until the problem is fully resolved, or until they themselves are dead. There is, functionally, no meaningful middle ground for them. He finally stepped back from the display. Members of the conquered, I will speak entirely plainly. This species is not remotely what any of us originally believed them to be. They are not a minor civilization deserving of pity or safe disregard. They represent, by a considerable margin, the single most genuinely dangerous species any of us has ever personally encountered. Not because of what they are currently capable of doing, because of what they will inevitably become. They learn considerably faster than any species I have ever personally studied. They adapt faster. They scale their efforts faster. And currently they are genuinely, deeply angry. He gathered his notes together. I would strongly recommend that every species present in this chamber begin treating humanity with precisely the same caution and basic respect they would extend to any established Tier 1 civilization. Because within our own collective lifetimes, that is exactly what they will unquestionably become, whether any of us particularly care for that outcome or not. He left the speaking platform. The chamber erupted almost immediately into open, heated debate. That debate continued, essentially unbroken, for 3 full days. Species that had genuinely never spoken to one another before suddenly found themselves engaged in heated argument. The various Kriv vassal species, historically forced to sit quietly in the chamber's back rows for centuries, suddenly found themselves being actively courted by nearly every major regional power present. Everyone urgently wanted to know exactly what the Kriv intended to do next. Everyone equally wanted to know what humanity itself would do in response. During those same 3 days, several significant developments occurred in rapid, overlapping succession. First, 14 separate conquered member species quietly opened private diplomatic channels directly with Earth, sending discreet messages to Ambassador Ockhaffer expressing genuine interest in future trade agreements, mutual defense arrangements, and broader cultural exchange programs. Ockhaffer received every single message graciously, responded politely to each one in turn, and quietly noted precisely which species had been among the very first to publicly suggest humanity should simply surrender. Second, a coalition of 6 separate species formally proposed preemptive sanctions against humanity, arguing that any species demonstrating this particular level of inherent danger ought to be carefully contained before becoming genuinely uncontrollable. That particular proposal was quietly tabled after someone pointed out, quite reasonably, that sanctioning a species currently in the process of decisively winning a war against the galaxy's most feared existing military empire might not represent the most strategically sound decision available. Third, and most significantly of all, Overlord Kethrix Von made one final, genuinely desperate move. The Kriv Ascendancy maintained more than 200 vassal species under its direct control, species that had been conquered, systematically broken, and forced into generations of service supporting the Kriv war machine. These vassal populations provided essential labor, critical resources, and in some specific cases, additional soldiers for continued Kriv military operations. Kethrix ordered these various vassal species to fully mobilize their own remaining forces, forming a defensive buffer between the core Kriv homeworlds and the steadily advancing human fleets. He intended, quite deliberately, to use them as a human shield. Humanity's response proved both elegant and, ultimately, entirely ruthless. Rather than fighting directly through the assembled vassal fleets, human ships instead broadcast a single message on every available frequency, translated into every language their systems could reasonably manage. People of the vassal worlds, the message read: "You did not choose this particular war. You do not have to fight it on the Kriv's behalf. Stand down and you will not be harmed. Rise up instead and you will finally be free. Humanity does not make war against the enslaved. We make war exclusively against the slavers." Within a single week, 3 entire vassal species formally defected. Their fleets stood down immediately. Their governments declared full independence. Their populations began openly tearing down Kriv monuments with their own bare hands. 2 additional species followed suit within the following month. The defensive buffer Kethrix had so carefully constructed was collapsing entirely, like a wall built hastily from loose, shifting sand. On the final day of the extended Concord debate, Ambassador Ockhaffer was formally granted the speaking platform on. See again, he stood there quietly for a long moment, looking out across the assembled chamber. He was genuinely tired. He had not slept properly in months. His formal suit was noticeably wrinkled, and his eyes were visibly red from exhaustion, but his voice, when he finally spoke, remained entirely steady. "6 months ago," he said, "I stood in this exact chamber and formally asked for help. You told me collectively to simply surrender. You told me my entire species would inevitably be destroyed and that continued resistance was ultimately futile. He paused deliberately. You were wrong. I am not standing here today to gloat, he continued. I am not here to issue threats of any kind. I am here simply to tell you that humanity did not personally choose to start this particular war, but we absolutely will finish it. And when it is finally, truly over, we will remember. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately across the entire assembled chamber. We will remember precisely who stood beside us when it genuinely mattered. We will remember exactly who offered meaningful help when we desperately needed it. And we will equally remember exactly who sat comfortably in these very same chairs and told us, quite calmly, to simply lie down and quietly die. He straightened his tie. We are not asking for your assistance now. We genuinely no longer require it. But this galaxy is going to look considerably different once this current conflict is finally over. And every single species currently present in this chamber is eventually going to have to live within the galaxy we ultimately choose to build. I would strongly suggest, he finished, that you all think very carefully about exactly what kind of neighbors you would prefer us to be. He stepped down from the platform without waiting for any response. The formal vote came the following day. By a narrow but decisive margin, the Galactic Concord imposed a complete, formal arms embargo against the Kriv Ascendancy. It represented the very first time in the Concord's recorded history that the organization had taken direct, concrete action against one of its own significant member states. It was not in itself remotely enough to save the Kriv from their ultimate fate. By that particular point in the war, virtually nothing could have accomplished that. But it served as a clear, deliberate signal sent not primarily to the Kriv Ascendancy itself, but to humanity directly. The galaxy was watching closely. The galaxy was, for perhaps the very first time in its long and considerably ancient history, genuinely paying full attention. And the galaxy was, without question, afraid of the small, stubborn, deeply angry species that called an entirely unremarkable planet third from an equally unremarkable yellow star its home. Afraid and simultaneously fascinated, and if pressed to admit it honestly, just slightly in awe of what they had witnessed unfold. 1 year after the destruction of Alara 7, the human fleet finally entered the Kryath system. Captain Renav Vasquez stood on the bridge of the battle cruiser Alara's memory, watching the surrounding stars shift steadily as the ship dropped smoothly out of transit. Through the forward viewport, she could clearly see Kryath Prime, the throne world of the entire Kriv Ascendancy. It was a large planet, dark and sharply angular, its cities spreading across the visible surface like intricate veins of solid metal. 3 separate orbital stations circled the planet in fixed, permanent rings. Defense platforms floated steadily in position, their weapons systems pointed outward into the surrounding void. This was the very heart of the Empire that had killed 6,000 of her people. This was, in fact, precisely where it had all originally started, where Overlord Kethrix Vaughn had personally given the initial order to destroy the Alara 7 orbital station. This was, fittingly, exactly where it would now, finally, end. Vasquez had changed considerably over the preceding year. She was noticeably thinner. New lines had appeared around her eyes, and gray streaks now ran through hair that had shown none only 12 months earlier. She moved differently as well, with the particular careful steadiness of someone who has learned, through hard necessity, to carry genuinely heavy things without ever letting that weight visibly show. She had fought in 7 separate major engagements since Alara 7. She had lost close friends, valued crewmates, and pieces of herself she understood she would never fully recover. She had also, in that same period, been formally promoted 3 separate times. Her original ship, the battered frigate Meridian's Watch, remained in active service still, patched and repaired so many times over that there was, at this point, probably not a single original hull plate remaining anywhere on its structure. She had transferred to the newly commissioned Alara's memory 6 months earlier, once the shipyards had F. Inali finished its construction. She had personally chosen its name herself. Behind her, the assembled fleet spread out steadily across the entire system, 240 human warships, supplemented by an additional 60 vessels contributed by the 3 vassal species that had defected from the Ascendancy to join humanity's ongoing cause. It represented the single largest human fleet ever formally assembled, equipped throughout with godkiller lances and additional weapons systems that had simply not existed a full year earlier. It was not, by any measure, the single largest fleet in recorded galactic history. It was not the most powerful fleet either, purely in terms of raw numbers. But ship for ship, weapon for weapon, it represented without serious question the single most dangerous force the wider galaxy had ever personally witnessed. Because every individual person serving within it had a genuine, personal reason to fight, and not one of them had any intention whatsoever of stopping. General Tanaka's voice came through clearly on the command channel from Earth. She sounded calm, as always, but Vasquez recognized something underneath that particular calm, the distinct sound of someone who had carried an enormous weight for a very long time, and was finally, at long last, about to set it down. All units, this is General Tanaka. Operation Requiem is formally authorized. Proceed to designated engagement positions. Rules of engagement remain fully in effect. Military targets only. Civilian infrastructure is not, under any circumstances, to be harmed. I will repeat that instruction clearly. Civilian infrastructure is not to be harmed. We are not them. She paused briefly. Good hunting. Tanaka out. The Kriv home fleet was already waiting for them when they arrived. It was considerably smaller than it should have been, by any reasonable prior estimate. An entire year of sustained warfare had thoroughly ground it down. The ongoing hit-and-run raids, the sustained guerrilla campaigns, the steady loss of critical supply depots, the defection of multiple vassal species, and the relentless, steady advance of human forces deep into established Ascendancy territory had all taken a genuinely significant cumulative toll. Where there had once stood thousands of confident warships, there now remained only a few hundred. Where there had once stood confident, thoroughly disciplined crews, there now stood exhausted soldiers who flinched visibly at unexpected shadows and whispered nervously among themselves about the endless. But they remained, unmistakably, Kriv, and they were actively defending their own homeworld, and they fought accordingly, with the particular desperation of a species that fully understood exactly what was ultimately coming for them. The battle itself began at precisely 6:00 system time. Vasquez personally led the vanguard, the first assembled wave of ships sent to engage the established Kriv defensive line directly. The Alara's memory surged forward, its godkiller lance firing in steady, controlled pulses that cut cleanly through Kriv shields as though they were made from little more than ordinary paper. Around her, human ships moved through coordinated patterns that would have been genuinely impossible only a year earlier, weaving smoothly between incoming enemy fire with a precision born entirely from 12 straight months of continuous, brutal combat experience. The Kriv fought hard in response, their orbital defense platforms pouring sustained fire directly into the advancing human fleet, their remaining capital ships forming a defensive wall between the approaching human forces and Kryath Prime itself. Vasquez lost 2 ships in the first hour of fighting, then 3 additional ships during the second hour. She felt each individual loss like a physical blow directly to her stomach, but she did not visibly slow down, and she certainly did not stop advancing. On the bridge of her own ship, she remained deliberately quiet throughout. She did not shout orders, and she did not slam her fists angrily against the console. She spoke instead in a calm, measured, entirely controlled voice, directing her assembled ships with the precise focus of a skilled surgeon. When a Kriv destroyer finally broke directly through the defensive line and headed straight toward the Alara's memory itself, she personally turned her ship to meet it head-on, fired her Godkiller lance at genuinely point-blank range, and then flew directly through the resulting debris cloud without so much as changing her own expression. In her own mind, quietly, she was reciting names. She had personally memorized all 6,000 of them, every single man, woman, and child who had died aboard Alara 7's orbital station exactly 1 year earlier. She had downloaded the complete casualty list on the very day it was officially published, and had spent the following month reading through every single name until she knew each one by heart. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a particularly healthy thing to do. She understood that fully. She did it anyway because she genuinely believed someone needed to remember them properly, and she had personally been present when they died, which meant, to her mind, that remembering was now unavoidably her own responsibility. She quietly recited their names now, one after another, entirely to herself, as Kriv ships burned steadily around her in the surrounding darkness. The battle itself lasted a total of 8 hours. By its conclusion, the entire Kriv home fleet had been effectively shattered. 40% of their remaining ships had been fully destroyed. Another 30% had either formally surrendered or been rendered completely inoperable. The remainder had scattered into deep space entirely, fleeing toward the outer edges of the system with human ships in active pursuit. The path toward Kryeth Prime itself now stood entirely open. Overlord Kethrix Von stood alone in his own throne room and watched the ongoing battle unfold through a holographic display. The room itself was large and deliberately dark, constructed entirely from the black volcanic stone the Kriv traditionally favored, and it was, at that particular moment, filled with the bodies of his own loyalists. A mutiny had begun roughly 3 hours earlier. Half his remaining officer corps had attempted to formally arrest him and offer surrender directly to the approaching human fleet. The other half had defended him instead. The resulting fighting had been brief and genuinely vicious, and when it had finally concluded, Kethrix remained alive, though most of his officers did not. He stood entirely alone now, surrounded by the dead, watching the last remnants of his fleet continue dying on the display in front of him. He was, by Kriv standards, genuinely old. His natural chitin had cracked visibly in several places, and his movements had grown noticeably slower than they had been even a year earlier. The war had aged him considerably, not primarily through the physical fighting itself, but through the accumulated weight of understanding. Somewhere across the preceding 12 months, he had gradually come to fully understand exactly what he had done, exactly what he had personally set into motion, and that particular understanding had settled deep into his bones like a slow, spreading poison. He had personally conquered 200 separate species over the course of his long career. He had broken entire worlds and enslaved countless civilizations. He had never once, in all that time, seriously doubted that he represented the single strongest military force anywhere in the galaxy. He had been wrong. He stared at the display and watched a human battlecruiser cut cleanly through his last remaining defensive line as though it genuinely wasn't even there at all. And he understood, with a kind of perfect, terrible clarity, that this represented the actual end, not merely of this particular war, of the entire ascendancy itself, of everything his species had spent centuries carefully building. It was all unmistakably about to fall, not because the humans themselves were monsters in any meaningful sense, but because they were something considerably worse than monsters. They were patient, they were persistent, and they genuinely, permanently remembered absolutely everything. A communication signal suddenly lit up across every remaining frequency simultaneously. It was not, notably, a formal threat of any kind. It was not a straightforward demand for immediate surrender either. It was something Kethrix had genuinely never once received from any enemy commander in his entire military career. It was, unmistakably, an offer. Ambassador Idris Okhafer's voice filled the entire throne room. It carried the same calm, steady quality it had originally carried when he'd addressed the conquered 6 months earlier. The very same voice that had once said, quite simply, "Humanity will handle this internally." But the actual words themselves had changed considerably. "People of the Kriv Ascendancy," the transmission began. "This war is over. We currently possess the capability to completely destroy your civilization outright. We will not do so. Humanity does not seek your total extinction. We seek your formal surrender, meaningful accountability for those who specifically ordered the murder of our people, and a genuinely lasting peace. You will not be enslaved. You will not be subjugated. We are not you." The message repeated steadily, over and over, across the entire Kryath system. Kriv soldiers throughout the system heard it, and enough of them, in response, simply stopped fighting entirely. Not every single one, but genuinely enough of them. Kethrix listened to the full message 3 separate times through. He stood entirely still throughout. The bodies of his own officers lay scattered around him. The holographic display showed his empire actively crumbling apart. The human fleet hung steadily in orbit directly above his homeworld, close enough to burn the entire planet to glass in an instant, and they were, quite deliberately, offering him mercy instead. He genuinely did not understand it. He had personally killed their people. He had burned their worlds. He had dismissed them repeatedly as vermin and had tried, with everything available to him, to grind them entirely into dust. And now, holding total, complete victory firmly within their grasp, they were offering him the one single thing he would genuinely never have offered them in return. A meaningful choice. He could face a formal tribunal. He could stand directly before his defeated enemies and be properly judged for exactly what he had personally done. Or he could simply die here, alone in his own throne room, surrounded by his own dead, remembered forever as the final overlord of a completely fallen empire. He stood there for a considerable while longer. The display continued flickering steadily. The human fleet remained patiently in position, waiting. Then Kethrix Vaughn, overlord of the entire Kriv Ascendancy, conqueror of 200 separate worlds, once the single most genuinely feared military commander anywhere in the galaxy, did something he had genuinely never once done in his entire life. He formally surrendered. The resulting aftermath proved quiet, complicated, arduous, and often genuinely painful. The Kriv Ascendancy was systematically dismantled, not entirely destroyed, dismantled instead piece by careful piece. Their remaining military forces were substantially reduced. Their surviving vassal species were formally freed. Their previous conquests were carefully reversed, one world at a time. Kethrix Vaughn himself was formally tried before an international tribunal that included representatives from 12 separate species, including 3 that the Kriv had previously directly enslaved. The trial itself lasted 4 full months. He was ultimately found guilty of crimes against sentient life and was sentenced to formal imprisonment. Not execution, imprisonment. The wider galaxy watched all of this unfold with a genuinely mixed sense of confusion and quiet awe. Most observers had fully expected outright genocide in response. Every species within the conquered had already witnessed exactly what humanity was clearly capable of doing, had already heard Tylon Ori's detailed presentation regarding their considerable capacity for both organized violence and personal spite in total war conditions. They had expected the Fury to eventually consume absolutely everything in its path. Instead, humanity had chosen to offer mercy. Not a weak, hesitant mercy. Not the mercy typically shown by a species that lacked the actual capability to finish what it had started. It was, unmistakably, mercy with real teeth still visibly attached. Mercy backed entirely by the absolute certainty that if anyone ever mistook it for genuine weakness, those same teeth would reappear without hesitation. The Galactic Conquered subsequently held a formal vote to elevate humanity to full Tier 1 civilization status. That particular vote proved entirely unanimous, not because every single species present genuinely agreed with the decision. Some remained visibly terrified of humanity's demonstrated capabilities. Some clearly resented them. Some still believed, privately, that humanity ought to be actively contained going forward. But nobody present was ultimately willing to be the specific delegation that voted directly against the species that had just dismantled the single most powerful military empire in the entire galaxy, and had then, quite deliberately, chosen to be genuinely kind about it afterward. Ambassador Ockhafer formally accepted the elevation with a brief, understated speech. He thanked the conquered for its consideration. He acknowledged the significant losses suffered on all sides of the conflict. He did not gloat, and he did not issue any further threats. He did, however, say one thing that would be remembered and repeated for a very long time afterward. We did not fight this war in order to become the very thing we fought so hard to destroy, he said. We fought it so that, hopefully, no one would ever have to fight it again. Scholar Tylon Ori eventually published his complete final paper on humanity as a species. It quickly became the single most widely read academic document in the entire history of the conquered. Species that had never previously even heard of Earth downloaded and carefully studied it. Military academies across the galaxy made it required foundational reading. Diplomatic training programs adopted it as a standard case study. The paper's ultimate conclusion was remarkably simple. They are not the strongest species in any absolute sense. They are not the fastest, the most numerous, or the most ancient. But they possess something no other species, currently in our extensive records, has demonstrated to a comparable degree: the genuine ability to become simultaneously the single most terrifying force in the entire galaxy, and then, in their exact moment of absolute, total power, deliberately choose to be kind instead. This is precisely why they are genuinely dangerous. This is also, ultimately, precisely why they will endure, not because they are capable of destroying absolutely everything, but because they are fully capable of destroying everything, and choose, quite deliberately, not to. Captain Renav Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Lyra's memory and looked down steadily at Cryeth Prime below. The planet itself remained fully intact. Its cities still stood. Its people remained alive. The orbital stations still circled steadily overhead, though their weapons now sat entirely cold and silent. Smoke still rose faintly from a handful of locations where the fighting had been heaviest, but those remaining fires were steadily being extinguished. and the wounded on both sides were being properly treated, while the dead were being carefully counted and formally named. Vasquez was tired. She was, in fact, more genuinely exhausted than she had ever been at any previous point in her entire life. She had been fighting continuously for a full year, and that year had taken things from her she understood she would never fully get back. She could still recite all 6,000 names from Alara 7 in order without hesitation. She understood she would always be able to do exactly that. That represented the price she had personally paid for everything, and she would carry it quietly for the remainder of her life. Her first officer, a young woman named Elena Torres, stood quietly beside her, looking out at the planet below. Torres had joined the crew only 6 months earlier, fresh out of the academy, and she had visibly aged what felt like a full decade in that relatively short time. She looked over at Vasquez with the particular expression of someone genuinely searching for an answer to a question she wasn't entirely sure how to properly ask. "Was it worth it, Captain?" she finally asked quietly. Vasquez didn't answer immediately. She looked instead at Cryath Prime, thinking of Alara 7 and of all the people she personally hadn't been able to save. She thought of Sergeant Herrera, who had lost 2 fingers and gained, in exchange, something close to a genuine legend. She thought of General Tanaka, who had carried the weight of an entire species on her own shoulders for a full year, and had never once let that weight visibly show. She thought of Dr. Schroeder, who had built a weapon capable of killing gods, and had then simply returned quietly to her lab to begin building something else entirely. She thought of Ambassador Ockhaffer, who had told the wider galaxy to go to hell, and had then, afterward, personally offered genuine peace to the very enemy who had started everything. She thought about every single person who had fought and bled and ultimately died throughout the preceding year. And she thought, finally, about the planet steadily turning below her ship, still standing, still fully alive, precisely because humanity had chosen, quite deliberately, to let it remain standing. "Ask me again in 100 years," she said quietly. She gave the order to formally stand down. The weapons across the fleet went entirely cold. The assembled ships held their current positions steadily. Below them, Cryath Prime continued turning slowly in the light of its own star, thoroughly battered and broken in places, but ultimately, unmistakably not destroyed. The war itself was finally, genuinely over, and the wider galaxy from that day forward would never once look at humanity in quite the same way again.